The sun hung low over the vast Dakota plains, casting a golden glow across the rolling hills where the Lakota people had thrived for generations. In the late 1800s, tensions simmered between the native tribes and the encroaching settlers, whose wagons carved deep routes into the Saccharine earth. Among these settlers was a young woman named Eliza Thornton, a widow of 25, whose life had been shaped by loss and resilience. She traveled with a small group of families, seeking a new start in the West after her husband's death in a mining accident. Their caravan, a ragtag assembly of creaking wagons and weary souls, had ventured too close to Lakota territory, unaware of the eyes watching from the hills. Eliza, with her auburn hair and fierce determination, had taken on the role of protector for the group's children, teaching them to read by firelight and soothing their fears with stories of hope. But hope was scarce now, as hoofbeats thundered in the distance, signaling the approach of a Lakota war party. The settlers huddled in panic, their rifles trembling in unsteady hands. Eliza's heart pounded as she scanned the horizon, knowing their meager defenses stood no chance against the skilled warriors. The Lakota, led by Chief Red Hawk, a man whose name carried both fear and reverence, descended upon the camp with precision. His presence was commanding, his eyes sharp with the weight of leadership and the pain of a people pushed to the brink. The settlers' cries filled the air as the warriors encircled them, their faces painted with purpose, their weapons gleaming under the fading sun. Eliza stepped forward, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. She had heard tales of Red Hawk's honor, whispered among traders and trappers, and clung to the faint hope that mercy might still exist in this clash of worlds. With the children clinging to her skirts and the settlers' pleas ringing in her ears, she faced the chief, her eyes locking with his. "Take me," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Not them." The words hung heavy, a desperate offering born of courage and sacrifice. Red Hawk's gaze softened for a fleeting moment, as if her plea had pierced the armor of his resolve. The camp fell silent, all eyes on the chief, waiting for his response. His 3 words, spoken low and deliberate, would alter the course of their fates forever. Red Hawk's voice carried the weight of the wind across the plains. "You are enough." The words, simple yet profound, stunned Eliza and the settlers into silence. They had braced for violence, for demands of surrender or tribute, but not this. The chief's eyes, dark and unyielding, held the depth that spoke of wisdom forged in hardship. He dismounted from his horse, his moccasins silent on the earth, and approached Eliza. The settlers watched, frozen, as the warriors held their positions, their expressions unreadable. Eliza's mind raced at had she misjudged. Was this a trick, or a test? She stood her ground, her hands trembling but her resolve unbroken. The children behind her whimpered, and she reached back to squeeze a small hand, a silent promise of protection. Red Hawk studied her, his silence stretching into eternity. He saw not just a settler, but a woman who carried the weight of her people's survival, much like he carried the burden of his own. The Lakota had suffered greatly at treaties broken, land stolen, and their way of life threatened by the relentless tide of settlers. Yet here was this woman, offering herself to spare others, a gesture that echoed the selflessness he valued in his own culture. He raised a hand, and his warriors lowered their weapons, a signal that eased the tension but did not erase it. Eliza's breath caught as she waited for what came next. Red Hawk spoke again, this time to his men, in the Lakota tongue, his words swift and authoritative. The warriors nodded, and 2 stepped forward to gather the settlers' weapons, but with no aggression. Red Hawk turned back to Eliza, his voice measured. "Your courage speaks," he said, "but courage alone does not heal wounds." He gestured to the camp, to the frightened faces of the settlers, and then to the hills where his people's future hung in the balance. Eliza understood, or thought she did. This was not just about her sacrifice, but about finding a path where both sides might walk away whole. She nodded, unsure of what she was agreeing to, but trusting that her plea had shifted something in the chief's heart. The settlers, still wary, began to murmur among themselves, some whispering prayers, others questioning whether this was salvation or a prelude to doom. Red Hawk's 3 words had opened a door, but what lay beyond was uncertain, a fragile thread of hope in a world torn by distrust. As night fell, the Lakota warriors made camp nearby, their fires casting flickering shadows across the plains. The settlers were allowed to remain in their wagons, under watch but unharmed. Eliza sat by the fire, her mind a whirlwind of fear and curiosity. Red Hawk had not taken her, nor had he taken the others, but his presence lingered like a storm on the horizon. She replayed his words a you and a trying to unravel their meaning. Was it a judgment of her worth, or a challenge to prove it? The settlers looked to her for answers, their eyes wide with questions she couldn't answer. She felt the weight of their trust, heavy as the night itself. A young Lakota warrior, introduced as Little Wolf, approached her with a bowl of stew, a gesture that surprised her. His English was halting but clear. Learned from missionaries, he said. Through him, she began to understand the Lakota's perspective of their land was not just dirt but a living connection to their ancestors, their buffalo herds dwindling as settlers' fences spread. Eliza listened, her heart softening with each word, though guilt gnawed at her for her people's role in this pain. She spoke of her own losses, of a husband gone too soon, of a dream for a better life that had led her here. Little Wolf nodded, his eyes reflecting the firelight, and for a moment, two worlds met in shared sorrow. Red Hawk watched from a distance, his expression unreadable. He had seen too many betrayals to trust easily, yet Eliza's willingness to stand for her people intrigued him. He had spared the settlers not out of weakness, but because he saw in her a chance for something different, a bridge, perhaps, between their worlds. He approached her now, his presence commanding silence. "Why you?" he asked, his voice low. "Why not another?" Eliza hesitated, then spoke from the heart, "Because I know loss, and I would rather bear it than see it fall on them." Her words struck a chord, for Red Hawk, too, knew loss of the deaths of kin, the erosion of his people's way of life. He nodded, a gesture so slight it might have been missed, but it carried the weight of understanding. The night deepened, and with it, a fragile truce took root, built on the courage of a woman who dared to beg and a chief who dared to listen. Dawn broke over the plains, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. The settlers stirred, their fear tempered by the fact that they still breathed. Eliza had barely slept, her mind consumed by the delicate balance of this moment. Red Hawk had agreed to let the settlers pass through his territory, but not without conditions. He demanded a council, a meeting where both sides would speak, not with weapons, but with words. The settlers were skeptical, their distrust of the Lakota rooted in years of stories about savages and massacres. Eliza, though, saw a glimmer of possibility. She had seen the humanity in Red Hawk's eyes, the way he carried his people's pain as her own. She convinced the settlers to agree, though their grumbling filled the camp. The council took place under a sprawling cottonwood tree, its branches heavy with the weight of history. Red Hawk sat with his warriors, their faces stern but open. Eliza stood as the settler's voice, her knees trembling but her voice steady. She spoke of their journey, of their hopes for a new life, and of her own wish to avoid bloodshed. Red Hawk listened, then shared his own dread of the sacredness of the land, the broken promises of the white man's treaties, the hunger that stalked his people as their buffalo vanished. His words were not accusations but facts, delivered with a quiet intensity that silenced the settlers' murmurs. Eliza felt the weight of his pain, and for the first time, she saw the conflict not as a clash of enemies, but as a tragedy of misunderstanding. She proposed a trade of supplies from the settlers' wagons in exchange for safe passage. The settlers hesitated, their greed for their possessions warring with their desire to live. Red Hawk's warriors watched, their hands resting on their weapons, a reminder of the stakes. After heated whispers, the settlers agreed, offering blankets, tools, and food. Red Hawk nodded, accepting the terms, but his eyes lingered on Eliza. "You speak for them," he said, "but who speaks for you?" The question caught her off guard, stirring something deep within, a longing for a voice of her own, not just as a protector, but as a woman seeking her place in a world that demanded so much. The council ended with a tentative agreement, but the true test lay ahead, as trust was a fragile thing, easily shattered by fear or betrayal. The days that followed were a delicate dance of coexistence. The settlers and Lakota traveled together, an uneasy alliance born of necessity. Eliza found herself bridging the gap, interpreting words and intentions between two peoples who viewed each other with suspicion. Little Wolf became her ally, teaching her phrases in Lakota, his laughter easing the tension when she stumbled over the words. The children, once terrified, began to play near the Lakota camp, their giggles mingling with the warriors' songs. Eliza watched, her heart torn between hope and fear that this fragile peace could crumble. Red Hawk, too, observed, his silence a constant presence. He was a leader who spoke little but saw everything, his decisions guided by a vision for his people's survival. Eliza noticed the way he interacted with his warriors, firm but fair, and the way he knelt to speak with the children, his stern face softening. She began to see the man behind the title of chief, a man who carried the weight of his people's future on his shoulders. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Red Hawk sought her out. They walked away from the camp, the grass whispering under their feet. He spoke of his sister, lost to illness brought by settlers, and of his hope to protect his people from further harm. Eliza shared her own story of her husband's death, her choice to join the wagon train, her fear of failing those who depended on her. The words flowed easily, a rare moment of vulnerability between them. Red Hawk listened, his silence a gift, not a barrier. "You are enough," he said again, and this time, Eliza understood it as both a recognition of her strength and an invitation to trust herself. She felt a spark of something new, or respect, perhaps, or something deeper, a connection that transcended their differences. But the peace was tested when a settler, distrustful and reckless, accused a Lakota warrior of stealing. Tensions flared, and weapons were drawn. Eliza stepped between the shouting men, her voice a plea for calm. Red Hawk's presence quelled the warriors, but his eyes held a warning. A trust was a thread stretched thin. Eliza knew that their survival depended on her ability to hold both sides together, a role she had never sought but could not abandon. The journey continued, each day a step closer to the settlers' destination and a test of the fragile truce. Eliza's role as mediator grew, her words a bridge between two worlds that seemed destined to collide. She learned more of the Lakota's ways, their reverence for the land, their stories of the stars, and their resilience in the face of loss. Little Wolf taught her to ride a Lakota pony, her laughter echoing as she struggled to stay astride. The settlers, too, began to soften, some offering small gestures of goodwill, sharing a meal, mending a warrior's torn shirt. But not all were swayed. A faction of settlers, led by a man named Amos, distrusted the Lakota and whispered of escape. Amos's voice grew louder, sowing doubt among the group. Eliza confronted him, her words sharp but measured, urging unity for the sake of survival. He scoffed, calling her a fool for trusting savages. The insult stung, but she held her ground, knowing division would doom them all. Red Hawk, too, faced challenges within his ranks. Some warriors questioned his decision to let the settlers live, arguing that mercy was weakness. He silenced them with a look, but Eliza saw the strain in his eyes. One night, a storm swept across the plains, its thunder shaking the earth. The settlers' wagons bogged down in mud, and the Lakota offered their knowledge of the terrain to guide them to firmer ground. Together, they worked through the rain, their differences blurred by the shared struggle. Eliza and Red Hawk found themselves side by side, pulling a wagon free, their hands brushing in the chaos. The moment was fleeting, but it carried a weight neither could ignore. As the storm cleared, a new understanding settled between them, not just as allies, but as people who saw each other's hearts. Yet danger loomed. Scouts reported soldiers approaching, likely sent to protect the settlers, unaware of the truce. Eliza's stomach churned at the thought of soldiers disrupting the fragile peace. She turned to Red Hawk, her eyes pleading. "We can't let this end in blood," she said. He nodded, his jaw tight. "Then we speak again," he replied, his 3 words a reminder that words, not weapons, held the power to change their fate. The soldiers' arrival was a spark in a tinderbox. Their blue uniforms stood stark against the plains, their rifles a threat to the uneasy peace. The settlers cheered at first, seeing rescue, but Eliza saw only danger. She knew the soldiers viewed the Lakota as enemies, their orders shaped by years of conflict and prejudice. Red Hawk's warriors tensed, their hands on their weapons, ready to defend their people. Eliza stood between them, her heart racing as she faced the soldiers' commander, a stern man named Captain Hayes. She explained the truce, her words tumbling out in a rush, but Hayes's eyes were cold, his mind set on dealing with the savages. Red Hawk stepped forward, his presence commanding respect, and spoke in English, his voice steady. "We seek peace," he said, gesturing to the settlers. "They walk with us, not against us." Hayes scoffed, but Eliza's plea for a parley held him at bay. The council that followed was tense, with words sharp as knives. Eliza spoke for the settlers, Red Hawk for the Lakota, and Hayes for a government that saw only conquest. She shared the story of their journey, of the trust built through shared hardship, of her own sacrifice offered to save her people. Red Hawk added his voice, speaking of his people's losses and their desire to protect what remained. Hayes listened, his skepticism clear, but the sincerity in Eliza's and Red Hawk's words chipped away at his resolve. The settlers, once divided, now stood behind Eliza, their trust in her unwavering. Even Amos, grudgingly, admitted the Lakota had kept their word. The council stretched into the night, with stories and arguments weaving a tapestry of understanding. Eliza felt the weight of every word, knowing a single misstep could ignite violence. Red Hawk's 3 words "you are an echoed in her mind, giving her the strength to keep speaking. By dawn, Hayes agreed to let the settlers continue under Lakota escort, a concession that stunned both sides. The soldiers withdrew, their departure a victory for words over war. Eliza and Red Hawk exchanged a look, a silent acknowledgement of what they had achieved. But the journey was not over, and the plains held more challenges, testing the bonds they had forged. As the settlers neared their destination, a fertile valley where they hoped to build their new lives, the weight of parting loomed. Eliza felt a pang in her chest at the thought of leaving the Lakota, whose ways had become a part of her. She had learned to see the world through their eyes, to feel the rhythm of the land, and to respect the strength of her people who refused to be broken. Red Hawk, too, felt the pull of change. His warriors had begun to see the settlers not as enemies, but as people with their own struggles. The children's laughter, once a foreign sound, now mingled with Lakota songs, a harmony that seemed impossible days ago. On the final night, the 2 groups shared a feast, a blend of settler bread and Lakota buffalo stew. Eliza and Red Hawk sat together, their words few but heavy with meaning. He spoke of his hope for his people, of a future where they could live without fear. She shared her dream of a home where the children could grow free from the shadows of loss. "You are enough," he said once more, and this time, it was a farewell, a recognition of her strength and the mark she had left on his heart. Eliza's eyes glistened, but she smiled, knowing she had found her voice in this journey. The next morning, the Lakota watched as the settlers' wagons rolled into the valley, their silhouettes fading against the sunrise. Red Hawk raised a hand in farewell, and Eliza mirrored the gesture, a silent promise to carry this moment forward. The settlers would tell stories of the woman who begged for their lives, and the Lakota would speak of the chief whose 3 words changed everything. Eliza knew the world would not change overnight, that conflict would persist, but in this corner of the plains, courage and understanding had won a small victory. As she looked back one last time, she saw Red Hawk's figure against the horizon, a symbol of hope in a divided land. The future was uncertain, but for now, they had proven that even in the darkest times, a single act of bravery could light the way.